Guten Tag, A-Push. We have a new video today. It's the bee's knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 8, Day 2, Revolutionary America. But first, let's do our daily punishment. Why should you never trust a train? They have locomotives. All right, kiddos, we're going to go over the American Revolution today. We're going to start off with some of the causes of the American Revolution. There were ideological causes like virtual representation, the idea that the colonies were represented virtually when people were voting in England because the parliament members represent everybody. The colonists said they wanted actual representation. They actually wanted to be able to represent something. They actually want to be able to vote to somebody to represent them in parliament. Republican was another one. The Enlightenment ideas, the Enlightenment. The Navigation Acts are going to be a cause of the American Revolution. It forced the colonies to trade with the mother country. For the most part, up until the French and Indian War, other than the Dominion of New England, the British will do salutary neglect where they'll kind of won't enforce these. So it won't be as big of a deal. The Navigation Acts don't become a bigger deal until they get rid of salutary neglect. The British will start to revoke some of the charters of the colonies in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Mercantilism was definitely one of the big causes of the American Revolution, which we talked about before. The colonies need to trade with the mother country. The Molasses Act was another one. Once we had the Glorious Revolution, and once they get rid of the Dominion of New England, there's going to be a period of salutary neglect from like the 1680s to 1750s, and relationships will cool between the British and the American colonists. The French and Indian War is going to be the big thing that's going to lead to the American Revolution. It was really fought because of the Ohio River Valley. George Washington attacked Fort Necessity. It also was part of a larger European war. There was also precursor wars in Europe and America that we talked about before, like King William's War, Queen Anne's War, the War of Jenkins' Ear, and King George's War. At first, the French and Indian War did not go well for the British. Their whole army will be wiped out under Braddock. When William Pitt takes over, he will put James Wolfe in charge. They'll conquer Canada. They'll defeat the French in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. The French and Indian War is going to be important for geopolitically for the British. It's going to give them control over Canada and India. It's going to make them the strongest nation in the world. They're going to get the Ohio River Valley, and they'll get Canada and America. There will be a rebellion in the Ohio River Valley, a Native American rebellion called Pontiac's Rebellion, where they didn't want the colonists to merge over. Because after the war, a lot of the colonists are going to start to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it's going to lead to the Native American uprising, Pontiac's Rebellion. The British will try to stop the uprising by appeasing the Native Americans with the Proclamation of 1763, which said that the colonists could not move west of the Appalachian Mountains, which is going to upset the colonists. This is going to end the whole period of salutary neglect. The British also need money after the war, so they're going to do the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. This is going to lead to the colonies being very upset. This leads to the whole idea about external versus internal taxation as well. The colonies will kind of unite for one of the first times with the Stamp Act Congress. The British will eventually get rid of the Stamp Act with the Declaratory Act, but they will pass a light tax afterwards, the Townshend Act. When the colonists start to protest that, the British will send soldiers into Boston, which will lead to the Boston Massacre. During this time, relations are getting more tense between the British and the colonists. You have the Samuel Adams is going to form the Sons of Liberty and the Committee of Correspondence. After the British pass the Tea Act, the Sons of Liberty will do the Boston Tea Party, which is going to lead to the Intolerable Acts, where they lock down Boston Harbor, they get rid of self-government in Massachusetts. After this, you will have the First Continental Congress, which was called the Association. They will pass the Olive Branch Petition around this time, but they're also creating an army. The first shots of the American Revolution were Lexington and Concord. We don't really know who fired the first shots. One of the big battles was Fort Ticonderoga. It prevented the colonies from being divided into two and separated. Benedict Arnold was one of the heroes of that. The first real moral victory for the American colonists was Bunker Hill. Even though they lost the battle, it showed they could go head-to-head against the British. In the Second Continental Congress, they'll make George Washington their overall commander. This is where they're going to do the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Paine will write Common Sense to try to appeal to people to support independence. At first, the American army does really bad. They're chased out of New York. They lose the Battle of Long Island. Under Washington, he will basically try to retreat as much as possible and just kind of wear the British out. He will defeat them in the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. However, by far the most important battle during this time was the Battle of Saratoga, where Benedict Arnold destroyed a whole British army. It was a turning point. Afterwards, the French will become allies with America, and it'll become a world war. One of our privateers was John Paul Jones. Benedict Arnold will become a traitor eventually. He doesn't feel like he was recognized for all he did. And in the Battle of Yorktown, the British will finally surrender to the Americans. This really pretty much ends the American Revolution. And we will have another Treaty of Paris. We have the Treaty of Paris, 1783, which ends the American Revolution. The Americans are going to gain independence, and they'll get the Ohio River Valley. Afterwards, we have the period 1783 to 1789, which will be the Articles of Confederation. It was a weak government. Each state had only one vote. They didn't have power for taxation. They didn't have a strong executive branch, no real judiciary branch. The European countries will be disrespecting America during this time. The Articles of Confederation was more like 13 separate governments than one. The British stopped trading with Americans. The Spanish cut off trade in Mississippi River. The big thing that makes people realize the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation was Shays' Rebellion. Afterwards, we'll have the First and Second Constitutional Convention. In the Second Constitutional Convention, there'll be a series of compromises, like the Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's going to create a federal government. Afterwards, there will be ratification. There'll be debates between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, and the Federalist will win. You're going to then have the presidency of my boy, George Washington. He's going to create some precedents. He creates secretary positions. He's going to make Alexander Hamilton the Secretary of Treasury and Thomas Jefferson the Secretary of State. At first, under Washington, the Judiciary Act will be passed, which will really kind of try to define what kind of power the judiciary branch has. Also, the Bill of Rights will be added. Some of the big policies for Washington's presidency is Hamilton's economic policies. Hamilton will push for the assumption of state debt to strengthen the power of the government. We have the IOU controversy, where Hamilton believes you should give the money back to the people that owe the IOUs, that actually own them. He'll create the National Bank, which is going to lead to the beginning of the two political parties, the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. You have the whiskey tax, which is going to lead to the Whiskey Rebellion, but Washington will be able to crush it. Washington's going to be dealing with the French Revolution and impressment. He does want to remain neutral during this time. He will sign a peace treaty with Britain called Jay's Treaty. And under Washington, they'll also sign a treaty with Spain, which will allow them to navigate the Mississippi River, called Pinckney Treaty. Washington's going to leave after 2 terms. He'll do the farewell address where he says to avoid alliances and avoid political parties. In the election of 1796, Thomas Jefferson will be the vice president and John Adams will be the president. The big issue of Adams' presidency, and Adams was a Federalist, will be the impressment and the war going on between Britain and France. The French were seizing some American ships. The Americans sent 3 ambassadors there. The French refused to even meet with the Americans unless they offered a bribe. This will be called the XYZ affair. This outraged the Americans that they were being so mistreated and disrespected. This is going to lead to a quasi-naval war with France, where we almost go to war with France. During this time, Congress, which was dominated by the Federalists, will pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. Most of the immigrants coming to the country were Democratic Republicans, so it was meant to limit immigration. And the Sedition Acts was meant to limit freedom of speech. Obviously, the Democratic Republicans didn't like these for good reason, and Madison and Jefferson will secretly help the states write the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. This leads to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions came up with the idea that a state can nullify a law they don't like. This is actually a really bad idea. It leads to the Civil War. In 1800, this Federalist Party kind of will split. Adams was more moderate than Hamilton, and Adams and Hamilton hated each other. In the election of 1800, Jefferson will be elected president. He actually tied with Aaron Burr, but he's going to win the election. And he's going to call it the Revolution of 1800. All right, kiddos, and that's all I have for you for today. Until next time, deuces, yeah.